Hello, my name is Mike Korenblit, and I'm with the Respect Diversity Foundation. I'm the co-founder. We are an organization that has a speakers bureau of Holocaust educators, civil and human rights activists, musicians, artists, storytellers, poets. Wherever their expertise, we send them into schools, churches, businesses, civic organizations to teach the importance of understanding, respect, and acceptance for all people. The reason we founded that organization was because of my own family's background, which I will be sharing with you. In the country today, we are going through a lot that's been happening, especially with the situation with the insurrection at the Capitol on January the 6th, with white supremacy, white nationalism. And today I'm going to connect how what happened to my parents over 82 years ago is relevant today and to that issue of white nationalism, white supremacy, and how that affects all of us today, and how we need to learn from history because of what the Nazis did using their own white supremacy, or as they called it, the Aryan race at that time. When I was 6 years old, I was sitting in the living room with my parents. And, okay. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong slide there. There we go. I was sitting in the living room with my parents, and it was the first time that I noticed, that's a picture of my parents there, Meyer and Manya Korenblit, in 1947, right after they had gotten married in Germany. But it was the first time I noticed a K and an L on each of their wrists. And on the inside of my mother's forearm was the letter A, followed by the number 27327. And being the inquisitive little people we are at that age, I asked my parents what those were. And they tried to explain to me, in the least horrifying and simplest of terms, that they were both survivors of the Holocaust. That was my first understanding and lesson and knowledge of the Holocaust and what my parents had gone through. First slide I'll show you here, for those of you, most of you have studied something about the Holocaust. The estimates are that somewhere between 5.8 million and 6.2 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. You see a map here of Europe and all the countries that the Nazis occupied during World War II. And as you will notice, there are black little strips there with numbers in them. The numbers indicate how many Jews were murdered in those areas. The largest that you see there is 4,565,000 in Poland and Western USSR at the time. You also see the country of Czechoslovakia, you see Hungary, you see Germany, and all the numbers. But what's important here, because it's important today to what is going on and what is not going on in our country, and that is three countries that stand out. The first one is Denmark. If you look up there under Norway, and you'll see it jutting out there into the ocean there, into the North Sea, is the country of Denmark. It has 120 people there. So you might think that Denmark didn't have a lot of Jews. Well, they didn't have a huge population, but they had about 7,800 Jews or so that lived in Denmark. The Nazis occupied them. But the Danes had a very vibrant partisan underground that did everything they could do to fight the Nazis and what they believed in. When the order came down that the Nazis were going to start deporting the Jews, the underground went into effect and went to all the homes of the Jewish population in Denmark and told them that there was a plan in motion to save their lives, and told them where they needed to be at what time and what day. And what they did then is the Jews met on the coast, and the Danes had brought together every kind of floating vehicle ship that you could imagine, from rowboats to fishing vessels. And what they ended up doing was ferrying the Jews across the channel into neutral Sweden, which is the little country to the right of Denmark there in the white. About 500 Jews could not make the trip. because they were either too elderly to make the trip, or they were too ill or sick to be able to make the trip. And those 500 Jews were actually deported to the camps. But the Danish government did something that very few other governments did. They followed where those Jews were sent. And they made sure that they got Red Cross packages where they got extra food, they got medical supplies, they got everything that could be sent to them so that they could survive. And because of that, only 120 Jews ended up perishing in the camps. That's the first country. The second country, if you come down here to Romania, you'll see a little blank country there. There's no name and there's no number. That's the country of Bulgaria. Bulgaria was a very anti-Semitic country before the war. It was an anti-Semitic country during the war. It had a Jewish population of about 55,000 Jews. They were allies with the Nazis. Bulgaria had even put in their own anti-Jewish laws prior to the war. But when the Nazis told the Bulgarian government that they needed to start rounding up their Jews to send them away, meaning into the camps, the second in leadership of the Bulgarian parliament said no, they were not going to do that. And there was a huge debate that took place about whether to abide by what the Nazis had ordered or to stand their ground. And that debate went on, and finally a vote was taken, and the person who led the opposition lost along with his followers, and they were thrown out of the parliament. So they then voted, and they voted that they would cooperate and start rounding up the Jews. However, what those people did not figure on was the other Bulgarian people throughout the country, because the rest of the Bulgarian people said, no, we are not going to do that. And they refused to cooperate or to round up the Jews. And because of that, 55,000 Jews were not murdered in the Holocaust because of the actions of the Bulgarian people. Now, why did the Bulgarian people do it? They were an anti-Semitic country. They had their own laws against the Jews. The reason they didn't do it was because they didn't look at those 55,000 Jews as being Jews first. They looked at them as being Bulgarian citizens, and they were not going to send their own citizens to the death camps. The last country I want to talk about is right under Yugoslavia. Again, it's a country that's blank, has no name and no number. It is the only predominantly, it was at that time as well as it is today, predominantly Muslim country in Europe. It's the country of Albania. Albania had a population of about 870,000. It was about 75% Muslim, about 25.9% Christian, and about 0.1%, 1 to 2% Jewish. There were about 200 Jews who lived in the country of Albania, but they had gotten along throughout their history with the Albanian people, with both the Muslim and the Christian community. The first country to occupy them during the war was the fascist country of Italy. And not much happened at that point, but everyone was hearing what was happening to the Jews in Europe, especially in Germany, even before the war. And so the Albanian government anticipated what might happen. And what they did is they made sure every Jewish person were given false identity papers and gave them new names, so that they either gave them a Muslim name or a Christian name, so that it would not be a Jewish name that looked like a Jewish sounding name on their identity papers. When other people heard about this, eventually, the Italians moved out and the Germans actually moved into Albania. But when people heard about what Albanians had done, refugees, which is an ugly word, as you know, as looked at in this country in this last administration, started flowing into Albania, from Germany, from Yugoslavia, from Greece, that were also occupied by the Nazis. And what the Albanian government did is they took in those refugees and they hid them out or gave them false identity papers, just like they had done the Jews living in Albania before the war ever started. About 2,200 refugees came into Albania, and the Albanian government took care of all of them. And it was only because of a slip up that one family was murdered and died in Albania. A Jewish family died in Albania. When we found out why the Albanian people did that, it's because of something that is in their culture. And it's based on the word Besa, B-E-S-A. Besa in Albania is one of the most important things that exists. It is an honor code. And that honor code says that you will take care of the stranger. You will put the stranger ahead of your own family member, even if it means death to a family member. And because of Besa, and because those people believed in it so strongly and what it meant, that not only were those 2,200 refugees, but the 200 Albanian citizens who lived there before the war were saved from the Holocaust. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that Albania, Bulgaria, Denmark would do what they did to save their Jewish populations, and the rest of the world that were occupied by the Nazis did not? Not only did they not, but in many of the countries, they collaborated with the Nazis to send the Jews away to the camps. Again, when I said 6 million, so you know, we are in Oklahoma. For those of you who are watching, will be watching this outside of the state of Oklahoma. It's the same number of people who live in Oklahoma, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Vermont today. There's a map of the United States, and it's those 5 countries. And I like to point out when I'm talking with students that imagine coming up from Texas, down from Kansas, across from New Mexico, or across from Arkansas, and coming into Oklahoma and not finding a single living human being in this state. Those are the kind of numbers that we are talking about. Why? Simply because of who they were. Not because of anything they did culturally, not because of anything they did economically, not because of anything they did politically, because they didn't have political power, and actually not because of anything dealing with their religion. The Nazis did not look at the Jews as a religious group. They looked at them as a race. They looked at them as an inferior race, subhumans. And that's why the Nazis were indoctrinated, the German people were indoctrinated into that belief, even though Jews had been integrated in Germany for 100 years. So how did it happen? Jews were sent to the labor camps. Here you can see Jewish males put to work at hard labor, usually 12 hours a day from 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning till 6 or 7 o'clock at night at hard labor. You can see they're wearing striped shirts and striped pants. Women were not spared. Jewish women, same outfits, only they had skirts on instead of pants. Same hard labor that they would do. Nobody knows the exact estimates, but hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered, died in the labor camps, and eventually in the concentration camps that they were sent to. Give you an example of how the Nazis looked at Jews, and try and picture in your mind how people are looked at today, whether it's in this country or in other parts of the world. What is happening there is that is a row of Jews coming up from the bottom of the page that you cannot see of a quarry. And what you see those people doing, those are Jewish men carrying boulders, bricks, stones on their backs, sometimes weighing 50 or more pounds, and having to walk up 186 steps to the top. If you look to the right and to the left, you'll see the ridges there. Nazi guards used to be standing on those ridges. And as a favorite pastime, at this particular camp called Mauthausen in Austria, they would pick out a Jew as he got near the top, and they would shoot him. Needless to say, he would fall, and what he ended up doing was then knocking over the people around him like bowling ball and bowling pins, and those people would fall to their death. Think about that. Shooting somebody in a situation as they were walking up those steps. Again, think to today. When the Nazis invaded Russia in June of 1941 and broke the treaty that they had with them, they swept through the Western Soviet Union, taking all this land. And with that land came a huge Jewish population. And what they ended up doing is they had special groups of Nazi soldiers called the Eisenstattengruppen that were trained to shoot these people. And what they would do is after the Nazi Wehrmacht, the army, would go through the whole sections of Western Russia, they would then go into every village, every town, every city, and round up every single Jew, from newborn babies in a hospital or in a house to the eldest senior citizen, and they would march them to the outskirts of town where large ditches had been dug, and they would shoot them, hundreds, thousands at a time. The estimates are somewhere between 750 and 1.2 million Jews were murdered this way. But that caused some problems for the Nazis. First of all, they were in the middle of a war and they were wasting a lot of ammunition on murdering Jews by shooting them like this. But there was a second problem that developed, and that was no matter how bigoted you may be, no matter how racist you may be, no matter how you've been indoctrinated to believe that the Jews were not even human beings, that they were subhuman beings, that they were cockroaches, which is a term that was later used in another genocide that took place in Rwanda. And that's how they were trained. But no matter how much you believe that, when your only job 8 hours a day was to round up those Jews and then proceed to shoot them from a newborn baby to an elder citizen, it began to have a morale problem on them. And that's what happened. And they found out of the people of this group, they had the highest percentage of alcoholism, the highest percentage of divorces, and the highest percentage of suicides that took place of any group because of what they were going through. So the Nazis were very creative, and they came up with something else called mobile killing vans, where they would drive these vans, depending on the size that you can see there, either 40 or 80 Jews at a time that they could pack into the back of the van. They would leave it running. They would pack the Jews in, and then they would take a hose from the exhaust pipes and run it inside to where the Jews were. Problem solved. You no longer had to use bullets to murder the Jews, and you no longer had to look at the faces of the people that you were murdering. But there was one detail about this that the Nazis did not like either. And what that was, it took anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours for every single Jew to be dead. And that wasn't fast enough for them. And that's when they had been experimenting on something else even before the war. Something called Zyklon B, which was a form of poison. The Jews were not the first victims of the Holocaust or of World War II or of the Nazi regime. Their own German citizens were. And who were they? When the Nazis came into power, they had a list of all the population, and they found all of those who had some kind of physical or mental disability. And they rounded them up, telling the families that they would take care of them, that they would be institutionalized, and that they would no longer have to worry about them, no longer have to take care of them, that the state would do that. So they rounded them up and they put them in institutions. And it was there that the Nazis started experimenting with Zyklon B and poisoning their own citizens. People found out and they were outraged about what was happening, and they demanded that this program stop. And the Nazis did for a while before taking it up again when things had calmed down. This is a group of women sent to a camp. You notice that their hair has been shaved. Point that out because you look at that group of women and you see the hair that was shaved from them. That hair was washed and then it was bagged up. That hair was then shipped back to Germany, where it was then used in making stuffings for pillows, for covers for the bed, and even eventually turning that hair into thread, which was then used in making armaments, bombs for the Nazis using the thread that eventually had come from the hair. So it started with the hair, and the Nazis used it of the Jews that they had murdered. Then the Nazis did something else, and that was they set up 6 extermination camps, all of them in Poland, with the express purpose of murdering Jews in a massive way. What they would do is they would round up Jews from the ghettos that they had been confined in, pack them into cattle cars, and send them on their way to one of those 6 destinations, those 6 extermination camps. They would take them to a large building, and they would explain to them when they got inside that because of the long train trip, many times taking 24 or 48 hours, because they were stopping along the way picking up other Jews, that they would be given a hot shower. And after the hot shower, they would be given a hot meal, and then they would be taken to their barracks. They even told the Jews many times when they got near the showers rooms to make sure that you had all your family's clothes neatly folded together or put on a single hook, so when they came out of the shower, they would be able to find their clothes very easily and get dressed so that they would be able to go on, be assigned to their barracks. So mothers would carry their babies, fathers would hold on to the hands of their young kids, grandparents to their grandchildren, and they would go in to the shower rooms. You look up at the top, you can see the shower heads there. That was the same thing that the Jews saw when they walked in, expecting water to be turned on once they got in. These rooms were about the size of a classroom, maybe 1.5 times the size of a classroom. And they would pack anywhere from 350 to 500 Jews at a time into those gas chambers. They would close the doors and seal it. And then either through the ceiling, where there was a slit that they would slide a steel bar, or on the door outside, and they would drop in the Zyklon B poison. Within 20 minutes, every single Jew would be dead. They would then suck the poison out of the chamber, and they would take special units that they had of people who would go in and take the bodies out, where they would be examined one more time to make sure there were no valuables hidden on their bodies. And then they would take the bodies to the crematoriums, where they would put them on those steel slats that you see, and they would shove them into the ovens, and they would burn them. After a long time, they actually would clean out the ovens of the ashes that were there, and they took those ashes and combined them with other chemicals, and they actually made fertilizer out of it. So it started with the hair and ended up with the body itself being consumed by the Nazis. Before anybody thinks that the Holocaust started with mass murder, it didn't. It started with simple acts of harassment and bullying. Here's an example of what the Nazis would have the Jews do. They would ground up Jews and they would have them start cleaning the streets. And you can see how they're having them clean the streets with those brushes, small little brushes. You can see families were brought to watch what was happening to the Jews. You can see a mother brought her small little child right there and back, and the other young kids there watching. Again, same thing, large crowds would gather to watch the Jews being humiliated and bullied there. And if the guards didn't think that you were doing it fast enough, they would literally beat you right there. Beat you to death sometimes, but if not, then you were taken away to jail. In addition to the Jews, estimates are, we have no idea the total numbers, but it was in the millions. But others were murdered the same way as the Jews were, including, as I mentioned before, the physically and mentally disabled, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Roma and Sinti, or Gypsies, were mass murdered as well. They were probably the largest group outside of the Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. Their estimates are 500 to 700,000 Gypsies were murdered. And communists and socialists, of course, whose ideology as far as politics was totally opposite of the Nazis. Freemasons, priests, pastors, and bishops who spoke out from their pulpits were also sent to the camps where they were also murdered. It's a picture of a group of Roma who were sent to one of the concentration camps, extermination camps, Treblinka. You see the kids there, you see the adult males. None of the people that you see in that picture survived. They were all murdered by the Nazis. November 1932, very important day. That was the last time there was a free, independent election held in the democratic country of Germany. In that election, the Nazis did not win the majority of the votes. They only got about 33% of the vote. But it was enough for them to combine with other right-wing parties to come into power. Now, in that election, what they have said is somewhere between 63 and 68% of the German population eligible to vote voted in that election. If more Germans had gone out and voted, what happened between 1933 and 1945 may not have happened. And that's why it's so important for people to understand. As I go through this and tell you why what happened to my parents is important to each of us today. How important it is to vote. In 2008, we had a presidential election that most people, historians and political scientists, say was the most important election that we had had in decades. Why? We were in the middle of two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we were on the verge of another depression. We were in the Great Recession that was going on, not only in this country, but around the world. And again, I will use Oklahoma because that's where we are and that's where I live. In February of that year, we had a primary election for president on the Democratic and Republican side. In that primary election, only 42% of the voting public participated in that primary. And in November of that year, 2008, when we had a general election between Senator Barack Obama and Senator John McCain, Oklahoma barely hit 50%. The entire country was at 53%. Can't emphasize enough for those of you who are watching this and will take this information and teach your students, for them to understand the importance of every election that takes place, whether it's at the local level with mayors, city councils, school boards, at the state level for your state senators, state representatives, and then at the national level for your senators and representatives that you send to Washington, D.C. Nothing could be more important. January 30th, 1933, the Nazis come into power. And the interesting thing about this here, as you see, is a parade taking place. You see people on the right there giving the Heil Hitler sign as the group marches by. They're carrying the swastika flags. I point this out because those are not adults that you're seeing march there. Those are young kids. And that's because all males between the ages of 12 and 18 had to join the Nazi Youth Party, where they were immediately indoctrinated into Nazi philosophy and Nazi culture, especially about the Jews and what the Jews were. The females between those ages also had a different organizations where they were taught all kinds of home economics. The purpose of the young men was, of course, to be trained, go into the army when they became 18 years old. The young ladies were being trained to marry those young men and produce babies for the Aryan race. That was the culture of Nazi Germany. May 10th, 1933. You see the names on there: Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, Ernest Hemingway, Jack London, Upton Sinclair, Sinclair Lewis, Helen Keller, Sigmund Freud. I ask the students, and I show them these names, if they can tell me, what do all of these people have in common? Since you can't answer me, I will tell you. They're all authors. And on May 10th, 1933, young people, older adults, walked into libraries all across Nazi Germany and yanked the books off the shelves by those people I just showed you there, thousands of other both German and non-German authors. And they took them into the middle of town hall, their towns, their cities, their villages, where they proceeded to burn those books because the Nazis said it didn't fit in with Nazi culture, Nazi philosophy, especially for their young people. "108 years before a single Jewish body was burned in the ovens. A very famous German philosopher and poet by the name of Heinrich Heine made the following quote because of something else that was going on in Germany at that time and in other parts of Europe. And what he said was, "Where one burns books, one will in the end burn people." 108 years before a single Jewish body was burned in the ovens. Probably very few of you do not know the titles that you see on there: Harry Potter series, the Twilight series, 50 Shades of Grey. Until we meet again, you may not know that's the book that I wrote about my parents' experience during the Holocaust. What they all have in common is that every one of those sets of books have tried to be banned in schools or in libraries somewhere in this country because people didn't like the content of what they were. Two movies that you see at the bottom there, two Disney favorite Disney movies, Aladdin and The Lion King. In 2012, we had somebody who was trying to get the presidential nomination that wanted both of those Walt Disney movies banned from schools, especially elementary schools, because they felt that they were inappropriate for the kids to watch those movies. Aladdin, because of obviously sorcery and flying carpets and all that kind of stuff. But The Lion King was for a different reason. For those of you who have seen it, you know that two of the favorite characters in there are Timon and Pumbaa. Well, this particular person felt that those two were gay, so it was inappropriate for young kids to be watching them. Whatever you may think about Harry Potter, Twilight series, 50 Shades of Grey, censoring them is not the option we should be using. Because you have an option, and your students have an option, and parents have an option. And that option is, when they're in the library, don't go and check them out. But you don't burn them. You don't segregate them, and you don't take them off the shelves. Because once you start doing that with any kind of book, you're only a step away from allowing it to happen to other books that other people may not like. We've seen it happen too many times in this country and other parts of the world, and we see it happening today in this country and other parts of the world. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each and every one of us today. Nazis consolidated their power, and in 1935, they passed the Nuremberg Laws. Nuremberg Laws were two laws which defined who a citizen could be of Nazi Germany. More importantly, it defined who a citizen could not be. Under those, there were a number of statutes, including no intermarriage between Germans and Jews. Jews were denied the right to vote. Jews were denied the use of public transportation. Jews could only live in designated areas. Jews could not eat in German restaurants. Jews could not stay in German hotels. Jews were denied access to state colleges and universities. Jewish students could not attend public school with German students. And Jews had curfews. There's a Jewish woman sitting on a bench in Munich, Germany, and it says, "Nur für Juden," only for Jews. This is a sign outside of a German village. And the sign says, "Jews are not welcomed here." Now, if those laws sound familiar to you, they should, if you've studied anything about history. Why do they sound familiar? Because of the Jim Crow laws in the United States of America. Germany actually sent people over here to study the Jim Crow laws. And what do those laws, statutes say? What do those laws say under Jim Crow? No intermarriage between African Americans, or coloreds as they were called at that time, and whites. African Americans had to ride in the back of the bus. African Americans were denied the right to vote. African Americans could not live in white areas. African Americans could not go and eat in white restaurants. African Americans could not stay in white hotels. African Americans were not allowed to attend state colleges and universities. African American students could not attend public school with white students. African Americans could not be in white areas after sunset. Across the South, including here in the state of Oklahoma, we had what were called sunset towns, which said no Black person could be in the city limits after sunset. And if they were, they could be arrested, beaten, and sometimes were even lynched, simply because of the color of their skin. Go back to one of the slides that I had showed you there, which is very important. African Americans denied the right to vote. And when you want to talk about relating it to issues of today, think about what is going on in this country right now. At least 246 bills have been introduced in 47 states in the United States of America to suppress the votes. And whose votes are they trying to suppress? People of color, whether they're Blacks, Hispanics, Asians. That is why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us sitting here today. This is a picture of a Jim Crow situation. Grandmother took her grandchildren into a restaurant to get lunch. You can see one of them laughing back there holding up the Confederate flag. Now, the interesting thing is, you notice that there is only one table where they're sitting. There was a table sitting there where they were. It was removed when they came in and sat down there. This is a picture of two burly policemen there in Albany, Georgia, escorting a young woman out of the public library, where she was not allowed to go into to check out a book. Again, that's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us today, and as it relates to what's going on in the world and in this country today. The Nazis then had issued the declaration that all Jews would have to start wearing a Star of David, either as a patch like that sewn on their clothes or on an armband, so that everyone would know who the Jews were. And they were open game for anybody to do anything they wanted to them. And when I say everybody, I mean from the youngest to the oldest. That was the situation. It's a map of Poland there. If you look down at the right-hand corner, you will see a little pink A there. And the town of Prubyszow is right there. It's right near the Soviet border, right on the Bug River. That is the town where both of my parents were born. Prubyszow was a town of about 20,000 people or so at the time my parents were born and lived there. Of that population, about 55% were Christians, about 99% of them Catholic, and about 45%, about 8,500 were Jews, with about 11,500 Christians. Jews had lived in this area of Poland for about 300 years or so. My dad came from an immediate family of his father, his mother. Those are two aunts in the back row there, 3 sisters and 2 other brothers. One of them is not in that picture. My dad's father owned a couple of mills in the area. And because of that, all the farmers, whether they were Jewish or Christian, would bring their goods to him so he could process it, so they could, their wheat, their hay, their barley, so they could take it to the market to sell. So because of that, my dad and his father and his family got to know a number of non-Jewish Poles, Christian Poles, very well. 3 of them who play a very important role in my parents' story. That is a picture of my dad there about a year before the war started in 1938, when he was not quite 16 years old yet. On my mother's side of the family, she came from an immediate family of her mother, her father, an elderly sick aunt who lived with them. She had 3 brothers and 3 other sisters. The 3 brothers are there, and 2 of her sisters are there. My mom's father was a handyman, a bricklayer, a builder. That's what he did before the war. That is a picture of my mom there about 2 years before the war, when she was not quite 14 years old yet. My dad's family and extended family came to about 35 or 40 people scattered around Poland and across the border into the Soviet Union. On my mother's side, it was also the same, about 35 people, all scattered in various cities in Poland. And that was the situation on September 1st, 1939, when my mom and dad were boyfriend and girlfriend, and the Nazis invaded and conquered Poland within a very short time period. Eventually, what they did is they moved all of the Jews into 3 ghetto areas. The area that you see that fence over there, believe it or not, was there when I went back with my parents to do research on the book, research on their story for the book. The gate to their ghetto right there was still up, along with some of the barbed wire fence surrounding that area. So the Jews were moved into 3 ghetto areas. My dad's house happened to be in one ghetto area. My mom's house was in another ghetto, and then there was a 3rd ghetto area. In the meantime, the Nazis has incorporated the same laws in Poland on the Jews that they had on the Jews in Germany, in Austria, and Czechoslovakia that they had taken over without a single shot being fired. But they added things. Jews could no longer send their kids to school, whether secular or religious. Jews could no longer have their symphonies, orchestras, theatrical clubs. Jews could no longer have newspapers, news magazines. Jews could no longer go to their synagogues and temples. Actually, the synagogues and temples were taken over and turned into storage warehouses for the Nazis, or even into stables for their animals. They also said, Jews, you cannot own a business, and Jews, you cannot work for Christians. Can't work for Christians, can't have a business. How are we supposed to make a living? To buy food, get water, medicine, clothing. You don't have to worry about that. We will provide the necessary things. My dad's early on sent his 2 oldest sons, who were 18 and 36 months older than my dad, across the border into the Soviet Union to stay with relatives there. Not because he thought they were going to be murdered, because nobody had any concept of that yet, but he was afraid they might be sent away to work, or they might be drafted for the military. But because my dad was not even 16 years old yet, and plus he had his girlfriend there that he really didn't want to be away from, he was not sent away with them. Then the Nazis initiated the work orders, where every Jewish male between the age of 13 and 65 would work for the Nazis from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening, most of the time at hard labor, building roads, working in the brick factories. So every day, my dad and his father, with their group, would be led out of the ghetto area to their work assignment. Now, because of my mom's father's work, when they found out he was a handyman, a builder, they used him for special assignments, to build things for them, to repair things in their homes, the buildings where they were. And what they would do is they would simply escort him to his work assignment, tell him what they wanted done, and they would leave him there by himself for 12 hours with no guards, just to do his work. And that was the situation. So one day, when my dad and his father were getting ready to be led out of the ghetto for their work assignment, My dad watched as two Nazi soldiers walked up to a young Jewish mother who was carrying her baby in her arms, and watched as one of the Nazis grabbed the baby, threw it up in the air as high as he could, while the other one proceeded to shoot the baby to see how many times he could hit it before it hit the ground. On another instance, my mom's mother sent her on an errand in the ghetto, and she watched as a Nazi soldier walked up to a young Jewish mother carrying her baby in her arms, and he grabbed the baby out of her arms, took it by its little legs, and walked up to the side of a building, where he proceeded to use the baby like he would a baseball bat. And my mother heard him make the comment, "That's one Jew baby that won't grow up to be a Jew adult." Those are the circumstances and the conditions that my mom and her family, my dad and his family, the rest of the Jews of Pribyshev, the rest of the Jews of Poland, and the rest of the Jews of occupied Europe lived under, simply because of who they were. Then the Nazis started doing something else in my parents' hometown, which we assume was going on in other places as well. That they would round up about 20 or 25 people at a time and take them away. Usually they started with the lawyers, the doctors, teachers, rabbis, and they would take them away. And when anybody ever asked where they were being taken, they would always say that they were being resettled in another part of Poland. Now, because my dad, his ghetto was in one area and my mom's ghetto was in another area, and they had to work 6 days a week. The only day they had off was on Sunday. And you say, well, that's okay. That's when most people go to church and stuff. Of course, to Jews, the holiest day is Saturday, not Sunday. So not only were the Jews living under the most dehumanizing conditions, but they were being forced to break God's commandment that they felt of not working on the Shabbat. So my dad wasn't able to see my mother because he had to go to work with his father every day. He couldn't get permission on Sunday to go and see her. So he did the only thing he could do. He waited one night until he was sure his parents were asleep, and he proceeded to sneak out of his house, avoided the Nazi guards in the ghetto, snuck under the barbed wire fence, went around the city under the barbed wire fence of my mother's ghetto, avoided the Nazi guards, and snuck into her house so that he could spend the time there with her. He would then get up early and sneak back the same way so that he would be there in time to go to work with his father the next day. Because if he had been missing, they would have taken his family out and they would have punished them, meaning that they would have shot them dead. So he did this every night so that he could be with her. But after he saw what was happening with the small groups that the Nazis were taking, one Saturday night, when he didn't have to be back home that night because he wouldn't be missing from work, he said to his girlfriend, my mom, that he was not going to stay there that night. Instead, he was going to sneak out of the ghetto and out of the city because he wanted to see where the Nazis were taking these Jews. My mom said she wanted to go with him. So they took off their armbands. So if anybody saw them, they wouldn't know they were Jews. And my dad proceeded to sneak himself and his girlfriend, my mom, out of the ghetto. And they went about a mile outside of the city, and they went off the road into this area and laid down in the brush so they wouldn't be seen. And sure enough, about mid-morning, the Nazis came marching down the road with about 20 Jews and Polish Christians who were collaborating with the Nazis and marching down the road. My parents followed at a safe distance so they wouldn't be seen. And after about a mile, the Nazis left the road and went into this big open field. And my mom and dad went into this little forest area and laid down in the brush so they wouldn't be seen. And they watched as the Nazis marched these 20 Jews up to two large holes that had been dug in the ground. Nazis ordered the Jews to take off their clothes, and then they proceeded to shoot those Jews, threw them into the holes, and then watched as the Nazis and the Christian Poles who were collaborating with them fill up those holes with dirt. And to the day that my parents passed away, my mom in April of 2008, and my dad in June of 2012, whenever they told a story about what they experienced, what they went through in the Holocaust, everything that they went through, 5.5 years, Nazi occupation, being confined in the ghettos, hiding out, eventually going back into the ghetto, and then eventually being sent away to, between the two of them, that would be 13 labor, concentration, and extermination camps that they would go through over the next 2 years. But of everything that they went through, they said this was the one thing that never left their mind. They always had images of this, because after the Nazis had finished filling up those holes with dirt, they could still see the ground moving up and down, because not everybody who had been shot had been killed. And the people who were alive were trying to dig their way out from the bodies and dirt on top of them. Eventually, the ground stopped moving as those people died of suffocation. And my mom and dad knew that they had to go back and tell their parents about what they had just seen so that they could protect their families. I mentioned in the beginning, because of my dad's father's business of having the mills, that he would take the crops of the farmers so that they could have it processed and take to the farm. One of the people that they became very good friends with was a young man by the name of Joseph Witneski, this 28-year-old young Polish Christian. And he used to hang out at the mill and talk to my dad's father. And they became friends, so much so that my dad trusted him enough that he would actually let my dad go out to his farm and help Joseph Wisniewski with his chores. But there were two other families that were also very close with my dad's parents, Polish Christians. The night that my dad got back and told his father what he had seen, my dad snuck his own father out of the ghetto and out of the city, and they went to about 2 miles outside of the city to a farm. And it was the farm of Joseph Wisniewski. Now, they hadn't seen Joseph Wisniewski in over a year, if not longer, because Jews and Christians weren't even allowed to associate. So they had no idea how Joseph would react to seeing them. But they knocked on the door, and he came to the door, and the first thing he did when he saw them was grab hold of them and started hugging them and asked them how they were doing. At which point my father looked at Joseph and told him about what he had just seen that day. And my dad's father then looked at this Christian Pole right in the eyes and asked him, if the time comes and we need it, would you be willing to help? Without a moment's hesitation, he said, of course. And they left it at that. Meanwhile, on my mother's side of the family, first day after my mom told her father what she had seen that day, the Nazis took him to his work assignment, told him what they wanted done, and they left him. The first thing he did when he was there by himself was he looked around the room and he found a single brick. And he took that brick and he stuffed it down his pants. He went about his work. After his 12-hour shift, he put on his coat. The Nazis came and they escorted him back to the ghetto. And the first thing he did when he got into his house is he went down to his basement, pulled the brick out of his pants, and he hid it away. And he kept doing this every single day until he had enough bricks of the same color and the same texture of the bricks that had built his basement wall. At which point then he proceeded to go down one Sunday when he did not have to work and built a false wall in the basement of his house, leaving just enough of an opening in the wall for each family member to lie down on the ground to be able to crawl through to the other side. Then he cemented some bricks onto a rod so that when he crawled through to the other side, he could pull it in front of the opening and it would look like that was the real wall. And then he began to get some non-perishable food and water and store it behind the wall for when the time might come when they would have to hide there. March 1943, a knock on my dad's father's house, very late at night. Now, if there is one thing you did not want to hear, living in the ghetto as a Jew, a knock on your door late at night, because that could only mean something bad. My father immediately and his father went down and answered the door. And standing there is this young man, 22, 23-year-old young man. And they immediately escorted him inside. And they said, "What are you doing here?" His name was Henryk Gorski, and he happened to be the son of the father of someone that my dad's father was very good friends with. And he said, "My father sent me here to warn you that tomorrow the Nazis are going to come into the ghettos and they're going to start rounding up thousands of Jews to take away." His father had built a hideout in his house to hide Jews that the Nazis were looking for. And because of his friendship, he was going to hide my dad's family out. Excuse me. Now, how did this man know that that was going to happen? He knew because he was still in the Polish government. And everybody knew if you were in the Polish government still, that meant you were collaborating with the Nazis. But what very few people knew is that his father, who happened to be the chief of police, was also working with the Polish underground in the area. And he had built a hideout in his house to hide Jews. Picture you see there, that house with the fence in front of it is his house where he built a hideout. And he hid my dad's family out for 24 hours until it was safe to come out. But before my dad left with his family to go into that hideout, he snuck out of his house one more time, made his way to my mom's house where he warned her family about what was going to happen. And they went down to the basement hideout where they hid out for 24 hours until it was safe to come out. 2 weeks later, knock on the door again. Again, it's Henryk Gorski saying that again the Nazis were going to come into the ghettos and start rounding up Jews. But he told him that his father said it was too dangerous to go back to the chief of police's house in case someone had noticed something or could become suspicious. So instead, they were going to go to another Polish Christian's house that my dad's father was good friends with, a man by the name of John Salke. John Salke was also still in the Polish government. He happened to be the commissioner of roads, which meant he was responsible for all the work that went on around the city. So he was giving the Jews their work assignments to build the roads. But because of his friendship with my dad's father, he was going to hide them out. Now, he ended up building a hideout in the attic of his house. Once again, my dad snuck out of his house, went to my mom's to warn her family. Only this time, though, the elderly aunt, who was very sick even before the war started, said, "No, I'm too tired, I'm too sick to go down. If they want to take me, let them take me." So my mom and the rest of her brothers and sisters lined up at her bed. They kissed their great aunt goodnight, and they went down to the hideout. That would be the last time they ever saw her alive again. The Nazis came into the house, found her lying in the bed, and they took her away. Doing research on the book, Jews had been taken down to the train station and packed into cattle cars. I found out that the Jews from my parents' hometown of Hrubieszów were immediately sent to a place called Belzec, was one of the 6 extermination camps. that had been set up by the Nazis. And upon getting off the train, those Jews were immediately sent to the gas chambers and then to have their bodies burned. Three weeks later, knock on the door again. This time it's not Henry Gorski, that 22, 23-year-old young man. This time it's John Salke's son. And I really point this out to young people when I'm talking to them. The reason I point it out is because Yannick Salke, the son of the commissioner of roads who hid my dad's family out the second time, is only 13 years old. He snuck into the ghetto. He knew what the risks were. He knew what would happen if he got caught, that he would be shot dead. And yet this 13-year-old kid snuck into the ghetto to warn my dad and his family about the deportation. But he had a special message from his father, and that message was, this was the last deportation. They were rounding up the last 2,000 Jews to take them away. And if you remember when I said in the beginning that Jews had lived in this area for almost over 300 years, and yet in a matter of less than 2 months, the Nazis were wiping out any existence that any Jews had ever lived there. So this was the time that they knew they had to go to Joseph Wisniewski, the young farmer who said he would be willing to help them when the time was coming. So as my dad's mom was getting his little sisters ready to go, my dad told his father he had to go see Manya, his girlfriend, my mother, one more time. And my dad looked at him and said, literally said, "Are you crazy? Have you lost every ounce of brain you have in your head? The Nazis have surrounded the entire city and you want to go see your girlfriend again." And he said, "I promise you, I will meet you at Joseph's." And with that, he snuck out of the house, once again avoiding the guards, getting into my mom's house, just as they were about ready to go down to the basement hideout because they knew something was going to happen the next day. And my mom was very excited to see him and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I came to see you one more time." And then he looked at her and he said, "I want you to come and hide with me. I want all of you to come and hide with me." And my mom's father thought about it for a moment and he said, "No, we've been safe here twice before, we'll be safe again. Why don't you stay with us?" And because my dad wanted to be with his girlfriend, he thought about it for a moment. Then he said no, because of the promise he made to his father. And he knew that if he didn't show up at Joseph Wisniewski's, his father and mother would think he had been caught by the Nazis and murdered. So he looked at her again and said, "Please come with me." And here's this young woman who had a decision to make. She's about 17 and a half years old now. And the choice is that if she stays with her family, she knows she might never see this young man again. This person that she loves as much as her own family, this person she loves as much as life itself, this person she wants to be with for the rest of her life, the person she wants to have her own family with. But if she stays there with her family, she knows she might never see him again. But she also knows that if she goes with him, she might never see any of her family members ever again. And she doesn't know what to do. And the next thing that happened is probably the most incredible thing that any human being could possibly do. Her mother took her in her arms and said, "It's okay. Go with him. Maybe if we're separated, some of us will have a better chance to survive." And what her mother was hoping is that she was sending her daughter to life. But the one thing that she was almost assured of is that she was probably never, ever going to see her young daughter ever again. And my mother made the decision to go with her boyfriend. And when they were about to leave, they turned around and looked at my mom's 14-year-old brother, Chaim, and she and he were very close brother and sister. And they said, "Please come with us." And Chaim said, "Yes, I want to go." Here's a mother that just gave up her daughter, knowing she would probably never see her again. But she felt she could do no less for her son. And she took Chaim in her arms and she hugged him and said, "Go with your sister." When they left the hideout that night, basement that night, that would be the last time they ever saw their family members again. A few days later, they ran out of water, and my mom's father snuck out of the house and out of the ghetto to get water for his family. Somebody recognized him, knew he was a Jew, followed him into the ghetto and back to the house where they were hiding, and then went to the Nazi headquarters to turn him in for the reward. The Nazis went to the house, they searched it, they found the basement hideout, and they then marched my mom's mother and father and the rest of her brothers and sisters to the outskirts of town, where they shot them dead and buried them in a mass grave. Meanwhile, my mom and dad and Chaim have made it to Yosef Wisniewski's farm. Now, what had Yosef done? The last time he harvested his hay, instead of taking it to market to sell, he built himself a large haystack at the back of his farm. And he kept building it and building it and building it until it was about 10 or 11 feet high. So it had this huge base. And then he went out one night and he proceeded to dig the inside of the haystack out so that there would be enough room for my dad and his family to hide inside of that haystack. And that's what they did for over 2 weeks. They hid inside of that haystack for 23 hours and 30 minutes of every single day. The only time they came out was very late at night or very early in the morning, when at risk to their own lives, Gorski, Salki, or Wisniewski, those 3 Christian Poles, would bring them food every night. They would go outside, get some fresh air, use the bathroom, and then go inside and wait. And finally, after a number of weeks, the chief of police informed them that the Nazis were no longer looking for Jews to murder. Instead, they were looking for Jews to bring back into the ghetto that they had reset up because they needed them for work. But they didn't want old Jews and they didn't want young Jews, which meant his fathers were too old and mother were too old and his sisters too young. So it was decided that my mom and my dad and Chaim would sneak into the ghetto because my dad felt he could help his family more from inside of the ghetto. When my dad left the haystack that night, that would be the last time he ever saw his parents again, or his sisters. Gorski informed them, the chief of police informed them, that they knew about a large ghetto in Sakul in Poland. So they thought it might be safer for them there because the Nazis were always out searching for runaway Jews, escaped Jews. So they got on a train and they went to Myslavich. That's the little town near their hometown where he had his other mill that he had turned over to some Polish friends to take care of it until the war was over, hoping that when it was over, he would be able to get his mills back. He put them up that night and they waited for the train. Train came, they got on it the next day. It stopped in their hometown of Hrubieszów. As the train started to take off, all of a sudden it stopped. What happened was someone who got on the train in their hometown recognized my dad's family, knew they were Jews, and went to the Nazis on the train and turned them in for the reward. They were taken off the train and they were shot dead there. Meanwhile, my mom and my dad and Chaim and my mom's best friend Tova are in the ghetto with 196 other Jews. The job that they had to do was clean out all of the other houses of Jewish material and pack up all the belongings to send back to Germany. After about 3 months, my dad was the only one that was not working in the ghetto of the 200 Jews. He had been assigned to work out at the Nazi headquarters place where they were outside of the city, where they had their livestock. And his job was to take care of the livestock. So he wasn't here this day. When Yannick Salki, that 13-year-old boy who had gone into the ghetto that last time before the deportation, snuck into the ghetto in broad daylight. His father instructed him to go find my mother and tell her that the Nazis were going to come in to the ghetto and round up Jews to send them away, because the Nazis had too little work and too many Jews, and they were going to make a selection. So she ran and she found Chaim, and she said, come on, we're going to hide until it's over. And here now is Chaim, this 14-and-a-half-year-old young man, who looks at her and says, no, I'm tired of running, I'm tired of hiding. He's lived through the occupation, through the ghettos, through hiding, back into the ghetto. He has no idea if his parents and his sisters are alive. And he just said no. So my mom thought if she took off running, he would follow her. And she made her way to the creek and laid down in the brush. And by this time, she had seen the Nazis had come in and rounded up the Jews in the ghetto and took them to the center of the ghetto, where they made a selection of 100 Jews. My mom's brother was one of them. And she watched as he was taken, put in the back of a truck and taken down to the train station. 3 months later, with no warning, the Nazis came into the camp, rounded up the last remaining Jews, including my mom, my dad, my mom's best friend, Tova, taken down to a train station where they were packed into a cattle car. There was a bucket, one end of it, if people had to use the bathroom, but they were so packed in, 50 people into a cattle car, that you couldn't even move. So even if you had to use the bathroom, you couldn't get to it. So people simply stood there where they were and used the bathroom. So you can imagine what it smelled like on the inside of those cattle cars. After about 24 hours of stop and goes, the train finally stopped, and they opened the doors and yelled for the Jews to get out. And they were marching them to what would be the first of 13 different labor, concentration, and extermination camps that they would go through over the next 2 years. The first camp they took them to was a place called Budzin in Poland. And as they got near, they started hearing this yelling going on. They couldn't figure out what it was. And as they got closer, they could finally understand what was being yelled. The Jews inside of the camp were yelling out family names in hopes of finding a family member that they had been separated from, that maybe they were being brought into the camp. So once they got inside of the camp, they were immediately separated into a men's camp and a women's camp, which meant my mom and dad were no longer able to see each other. My dad hooked up with 4 young men that he would eventually go through all the camps with. My mom hooked up, and her close friend Tova hooked up with 3 other young women that they would eventually go through all the camps with together. On the 3rd day or so, my dad found my mom in the food line, and he asked her where her barrack was located, at which point she explained where it was and what the number was. And that night, my dad asked his 4 buddies if they would cover for him if the Nazis came in unexpectedly to do a check. And they said, of course. They would pull the blanket up over them so the Nazis couldn't tell how many Jews were lying in that bunk. And that night, my dad proceeded to sneak out of the barrack, avoided the Nazi guards, crawled under the barbed wire fence of the men's camp, across the open area, under the barbed wire fence of the women's camp, found my mother's barrack, where he snuck inside and would spend the night there with her. He then got up very early the next morning and would sneak back the same way, because every morning before the sun came up, Jews were awoken and had to go outside to be counted for roll call. And if any Jew was missing, then they would stand there all day until that Jew was located. So he did this every night so that he could be with her. And one night while he was lying there, he said, make me a promise. She said, of course. He said, promise me that if something happens and we're separated, when this is over, you will meet me back in our hometown. And she said, of course. 2 weeks later, the Nazis came into the women's camp, rounded them up, and took them away. And that would be the last time my mom and dad saw each other for almost 18 months. My mom was sent through 4 more camps. The next one she was sent to was a place called Mielec in Poland. And it was there that she got the K and the L tattooed on her wrist that I saw as that 6-year-old little boy growing up in Ponca City, Oklahoma. From there, she was sent to another camp that many of you may be familiar with if you watched the movie Schindler's List, because the camp that she was sent to was a place called Plaszow. And it was at Plaszow that Oskar Schindler, the Nazi industrialist, saved over 1,200 Jews by taking them out of the camp to work at his factory. My mom didn't know him or heard about anything that had happened in that sense. Then she was transferred out of Plaszow, and she was taken on a long train trip. And as the train was slowing down, my mom and her friends began to smell this terrible odor, and they could not figure out what it was. They'd never smelled anything like that before. And finally, the train stopped. They opened the cattle car doors, and that smell hit them 100 times worse. They were ordered off the train and told to line up. And they lined up with all the other people that had been on the train. And everybody had to go before this Nazi colonel, who would look at every single Jew and simply with his thumb would point to the right or to the left. Most of the people were sent to the left, his left. Nobody knew if that was good or bad. My mom and her 4 friends and about 60 other people were sent to his right. So they had no idea if that was good or bad. But as they were being led away to their barrack, you can see this is in Auschwitz. Those are the concrete poles that would hold the barbed wire up. That second round of barbed wire was electrocuted if you got through the first one, so that it would electrocute you. My mom saw a group of men standing over there, and she did the thing that she had first learned in Budzin. And she yelled out, Chaim Nagelstein. And somebody yelled back to her, yes. And she thought she had found her brother. And again, she yelled out, Chaim Nagelstein. And the person yelled back, and she saw the person who was yelling was not her brother. And he yelled to her, I knew him, they took him away yesterday. When my mom was finally taken into her barrack, the other Jewish women inside informed him that they had just been brought to a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the smell that they had been smelling was of those Jews who had been sent to the crematorium and were being burned. So my mom knew what it meant when this person said he was sent away yesterday. My mom was very lucky, along with 299 other young women. They were selected, sent out of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which very few people were, and sent to a camp in Czechoslovakia. She was there for a number of months until March of 1945, when the camp was liberated by the Russian forces. When my mom was liberated, she was not quite 20 years old. She was 5'1", and she weighed 65 pounds. Meanwhile, my dad had gone through 7 more camps. The most famous that you probably heard about, I told you about Mauthausen in Austria, where he had to take those boulders, excuse me, up those 185 steps with a boulder of 50 to 100 pounds on his back. He was in Dachau. He was in a camp called Flossenburg, camp in Germany and Czechoslovakia called Leitmeritz. The first camp that he was sent to from Budzin, the first camp was also to Mielec. It was there that he got the K and L tattooed on his wrist there. That's what they did there. My mom, by the way, it was in Auschwitz-Birkenau that she got the letter A followed by the number 27327 that I showed you before in Auschwitz. Finally, my dad was sent to a place called Korenblit. 3 times in the camps, he was nearly beaten to death. Twice he was saved by his friends, who literally dragged him off of the beating and hid him under the bunk until they could get him well enough to he can go back out to the roll call and go back to work. In Koffering, by this time, the Allies were in Germany, making their way across Germany. So what the Nazis were doing is they were literally taking the Jews on what were called death marches, where they would walk them literally to death. If a Jew fell by the roadside, they simply shot him right there and left him. So my dad and his 4 buddies knew that they were going to be murdered anyway, so they should try and get away. So on the second night, they waited until they thought the guards were asleep, and they proceeded to crawl along the ground for about 100 yards before they jumped up and started running as fast as their skeleton bodies would take them, until they finally found this barn. And they went inside, totally exhausted, and fell asleep. They were awoken the next morning by this yelling, by somebody singing, and by a dog barking. One of my dad's friends went and peeked out, and sure enough, it was the German farmer coming toward the barn, obviously to do some chores. So they knew they had to hide, so they buried themselves underneath the hay. A couple of minutes later, they heard the door open, and they could feel the dog running around on top of them. And the chore that the farmer had to do first was to pitch some hay for his livestock. So he immediately took the pitchfork, stuck it into the hay, and he stuck one of my dad's friends right in the leg. He jumped up and yelled. The farmer's so shocked, he yells. My dad and his other 3 buddies, they jump out of the hay, and they're all staring at each other. And they explain to this German farmer who they are, that they had just escaped from this march by the Nazis. And the farmer told them to wait here, as though they had a choice. They had on those uniforms that you can see right there. And anybody who had that on, everyone knew that you would escape from a camp if you were wearing those clothes. So it was broad daylight, so they had no choice but to trust him. 20 minutes later, he came back with a basket of food and some water. But he told them, but when it gets dark, you have to leave, because if the Nazis find you here and think I was helping you, they'll kill me and my family. So they promised that they would leave that night. That night it got dark. I slipped out the door, went about 10 feet and said, where are we going? They had no idea which way to go, whether they were going to march right into the Nazis or whether they were going to march into the Allies. So they decided to get another good night's sleep. And they were awoken the next morning by this rumbling sound. One of my dad's friends again went and peeked out the door, and they said, what is it? What is it? And he turned around and he looked at them. And there were tears coming down his face, and he couldn't talk. So then my dad and the other 3 went over and peeked out the door. And coming down the road was something that my dad said he had only seen one other time before in his life, and he had seen it in a book in school. Because coming down the road were Jeeps and trucks with American flags on them. And my dad and his 4 buddies went outside and were liberated by the American forces. That was April the 19th, 1945. He was 5'10". He was not quite 21, and he weighed 87 pounds. Needless to say, my parents' story is a story about 3 miracles. The first miracle is the fact that they even survived the war in the first place. The second is that they found each other after the war, which they did. They both fulfilled the promise and went back to their hometown. The third, and then they eventually immigrated to the United States of America in 1950, where they were sent to, believe it or not, of all places, Ponca City, Oklahoma. The third miracle happened 39 years later when I was doing research on the book. And I ended up finding my mom's brother, Chaim, who she thought had been sent into the gas chambers, which he actually had at Auschwitz-Birkenau, alive and well and living in Newcastle, England. And on January the 30th, 1982, after 39 years of separation at 11:01 British time, my mom and her brother saw and touched each other for the first time. I have a list of 13 people on the screen there. I don't know if any of you recognize those names, but whenever I ask the students or other groups, when I go and put those names up there, people say, no, for the most part, don't recognize any of the names on there. The thing is, everybody should know those 13 names that are on there, because those people helped change the course of not only Oklahoma City and Oklahoma, but American history. The youngest person on there was 13 years old. The oldest on there was 16 and a half years old. In August of 1958, my dad came home from work and did the thing he always did. Turned on the TV, sat down in his favorite chair and watched the news. And on that hot August day, there was a news story that really bothered him. And he kept following that story for the next week until he finally had a day off. And it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was playing in the backyard, and my dad came back there and yelled to me to come in because he wanted me to take a ride with he and my mom. We got in the car, and my parents drove me to a park in Ponca City. They parked the car, and we got out. We walked into the park, and my dad walked me up to a water fountain, and he asked me to take a drink out of it. And I did. And he said, how did that taste? And I said, great. Cold water on a hot August day in Oklahoma, what's better than that? And my dad then asked me to read the sign on the water fountain to him. And I did. And it said, whites only. My parents then walked me to a water fountain not 10 feet away, and they asked me to take a drink out of it. And I did. And he said, how did that taste? And I said, the same as the water that I just drank out of over there. And again, my dad asked me to read the sign on the water fountain to him. And I did. And it said, coloreds only. Without saying a word, my mom and my dad and I walked back to the car. And my father proceeded to drive down to the bus station. He parked the car, we got out, and we walked inside. Nice waiting area, ceiling fans going on this hot August day. And my parents walked me up to this podium that had a sign on it. He said, read the sign with us, Mike. And the three of us read the sign together, and it said, white waiting area. My parents then walked me to the back of the bus station. Now, something that I didn't tell you before that I'll tell you now is that at this point, neither of them have known about any family member that survived the Holocaust. All of their extended family were murdered as well in the Holocaust. So we walked to the back of the bus station area, a not so nice area, broken chairs, no ceiling fans going, hot, sweaty area, and there's a sign up on the wall. And again, my father asked me to read the sign with them. And the three of us read the sign together, and it said, colored waiting area. And my dad looked at me, his 7-year-old son, and he said, I want you to always remember what I've shown you here today, because that's the reason that you don't have any grandparents and lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, because people looked at them as being different and inferior human beings. What my dad saw on television that day that so bothered him that he wanted to make sure his son understood it was a story of those 13 people that I have listed on the page right there, age 7 to 16 and a half, who were driven to downtown Oklahoma City and they walked into a place called Cat's Drug Store, where they walked in with their supervisor, with their counselor, a woman by the name of Clara Looper, and proceeded to sit down at the counter and ordered 13 Coca-Colas. They were refused service, and they continued to sit there all day as people started gathering and started calling them names. And they sat there very peacefully. Cat's Drug Store closed at 5 o'clock. They got up very peacefully and they left. They were the first ones back the next day. They went down, sat at the counter, and ordered 13 Cokes. By this time now, lots of people had heard about it, and large crowds had gathered. Only this time, they weren't as nice. They were shoving them in the back, slapping them on the heads, calling them every name in the book, including the N-word, over and over. And they sat there and they took it. Cat's Drug Store closed, 5 o'clock. They left very peacefully. And they were the first ones back the next day. Only this time they started doing other things to them. They started breaking raw eggs on top of their heads. One person, they said, even brought a chicken and put it on top of the heads of the males so that it would scratch the tops of their heads. But they sat there and they took it. Again, they left and were there the next day. Only this time, the drugstore had actually physically removed the stools from the bar, from the counter area, so they couldn't sit down. They had to stand, which they did all day long. The company that owned Cat's Drug Store happened to own 20 or 25 other drugstores in Oklahoma, in Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas. And after that third or fourth day, I don't remember what it was, they sent out a letter to all of their other drugstores, informing them that you would immediately begin serving your Black customers. So when they walked in that day and the stools had been put back and they sat down and ordered 13 Cokes and 13 hamburgers, they were served. They didn't go back to Cat's Drug Store the next day. Instead, they went to a place called Brown's Department Store, walked inside, sat down at the counter, and ordered 13 Cokes. Those 13 people that you see on the screen right there helped change the course of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and American history, because they started the sit-in movement in this country. It was not started in the Carolinas with college students. It was started with these young kids here in Oklahoma. They continued to demonstrate for 5.5 years until August of 1964, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which desegregated public places. What you do matters every day in your life. Those people were not afraid to stand up for what they believed in, and injustice, because of the color of their skin. We know what's going on in this country today. And when it comes to what you do matters, think about this. After World War II and the Holocaust, we learned about it. The world said never again would we allow something like that to happen. Never again. Never again, President Lyndon Johnson. 1968, Nigeria, over 1 million ethnic Ibibos are murdered by their own government, as the United States and the world sat back and watched. President Richard Nixon, 1971, 1 to 2 million Bengalis are murdered by the Pakistani government, as the United States and the world sat back and watched. During that time, over 200,000 Bengali women were raped by Pakistani soldiers. Why is that such an important thing to point out? It's important to point out because the Bengali women are Muslim. And if a woman has intercourse outside of her marriage, she is an outcast. This was a way of committing genocide, because if no children can be born, then the population will begin to be decimated. 1972, in Burundi, the Tutsi government murders over 200,000 of its ethnic Hutu citizens. Once again, as the world sat back and watched, including the United States. President Gerald Ford, 1975 to 76, over 1 million Cambodians are murdered by their own government, the Khmer Rouge, as the United States and the world sat back and watched. President Jimmy Carter, 77 to 79, another 1 to 2 million Cambodians are murdered by their own government. Until finally, Vietnam invaded and stopped the genocide, the mass murder that was going on there. And of course, they got criticized for doing that, invading another country. President Ronald Reagan, 1988, Iraq, thousands of ethnic Kurds are murdered by Saddam Hussein and his forces. President George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 92, Iraq, again, thousands of ethnic Kurds are murdered as the world sat back and watched. There is an iconic picture that was shown either in Newsweek or Time on the cover of a mother lying on the concrete road with her kids, all dead. And the caption read, "Murdered, killed by being gassed." You have to realize this is only 24 years since the world saw the Holocaust and the mass murder of Jews being gassed in the gas chambers. And Saddam Hussein gassed his own people. 1991 to 92, Bosnia. Over 100,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs as the United States and the world sat back and watched. President Bill Clinton, 1993 to 95, Bosnia, another 150 to 200,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs. Until finally, NATO forces began bombing to stop the Serbs from murdering the Muslim population there, which brought them to the peace tables. 1998 to 99, Kosovo, 25 to 50,000 ethnic Albanian Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs. We don't know the total number there because they're still actually digging up mass graves in Kosovo. Again, Bill Clinton, never again. 1994, Rwanda. Over 800,000 ethnic Tutsi are murdered by the Hutu government in 93 days. September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland with the start of the Holocaust. It ended May 8th, 1945, 5.5 years. And in that time period, 6 million Jews were murdered. Everybody understand, the world and the United States sat back and watched 800,000 people be murdered in 93 days. Not in a systematic way. There were no gas chambers. There were no crematoriums. Most of them were beaten to death with sticks or macheted to death. And just to give you an idea about what that is, that's 8,602 a day. That was 358 people an hour, and 6 people every minute were murdered. And the world sat back and watched. George W. Bush, president, never again, 2003 to 2009, in the Darfur region of the Sudan. Over 700,000 ethnic Sudanese are murdered by their own government, and 1 to 2 million are displaced. President Barack Obama took over on January 20th, 2009. says present, but obviously it's not present. It was to January 20th, 2016 until Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. Another 1 million ethnic Sudanese were murdered by their government, and 2 to 3 million total were displaced. August 2014, Mount Sinjar in Iraq. Something happened there that had never happened in the history of the world before that we know of. 50 to 60,000 Yazidis were trapped by ISIS, and a genocide was about to begin to take place. President Obama ordered the United States Air Force to go in and start bombing. And because of that, for the first time in history that we know of, a genocide was stopped before it ever got started. But then you have January 20th, 2011 to January 20th, 2017 in Syria. Over 500,000 civilians, including 55,000 children, were killed. President Barack Obama never again, January 20th, 2011 to January 20th, 2017. Myanmar, former country of Burma. Ethnic cleansing, if not a genocide, is taking place on the Rohingya Muslims in that country. And it's still going on today. President Donald Trump, January 20th, 2017, took over Syria, took over Myanmar, and he still had the Sudan, the Darfur region of the Sudan, under his watch. Also saying never again. Not had time to change it, to put up President Bush, but he inherited every one of those situations as well. So it's going on under his watch as well. What we do matters every day in our life. Standing up and making sure that we stop these genocides is something that we need to do. I know you all know Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. On April 20th, 1999, when 2 young men walked into their school, murdered 12 of their classmates and 1 of their teachers. When they found the tape that they made, a videotape, it says the reason they did it is because they were bullied in their school by classmates and were looked at as outcasts because of the way that they dressed. The names you see on there are just examples. Every one of those people committed suicide. The estimates are 300 to 400 at a minimum commit suicide every single year because of cyberbullying. It's not like they can go home and get away from the school and that they leave it. It's done on their phones, it's done on their computers. If you think those places are far away, Ty Fields was 11 years old from Perkins, Oklahoma, who committed suicide in May 2010. He told his parents about what was happening at school. His parents went to the school, told him what was happening, and they said they would take care of it. They did nothing, and the bullying continued until finally he could take it no longer. And he went and committed suicide. Oklahoma, latest statistics, these are from like 2019, I think. K through 5, 11,114 cases were reported of bullying. And 6th through 8th graders, 18,032. 9th high school, 9th grade through 12th, 9,963. It's estimated that less than 50% of the incidents of bullying are even reported to officials in the school. United States of America, over 3 million. Every day, 160,000 students make the decision not to go to school out of fear of walking in there and what's going to happen to them. Every 7 minutes that school's in session, a student is bullied. 4% of the time, when an adult sees it happening, they intervene, which means 96% of the time that they see it, they do nothing. 11% of the time, the peers, other students, intervene. But again, that means 89% of the time, nobody steps in. 85% of the time, people who see bullying going on do nothing about it. That's why what you do matters every single day. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us every single day. Oklahoma City, April 19th, 1995. The bombing of the Murrah Federal Office Building, where 186 people are murdered by Timothy McVeigh out of racism and out of bigotry. Why do I say that? Because when he was arrested, in the passenger side of his car, they found a book called the Turner Diaries, which was an anti-government, anti-Semitic, racist book. And in that book, he had underlined passages in there about Jews and about Blacks. April 18th, 1995, one day before the Murrah bombing, there was one hate website on the internet. Today, there are thousands of them, including www.gasadjewforjesus.com, www.killahomoforgod.com. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago was important to each of us who are watching this today. 15,000 are the number of reported incidents of hate crimes that take place in this country every year. One hate crime every hour. Every day, at least 8 Blacks, 3 whites, 3 Jews, 2 Latinos, 2 gays, and 2 Muslims are the victim of a hate crime, simply because of who they are. The data, FBI data, it's soaring for anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, and anti-Black incidents. Black and Jewish have gone up dramatically during the last 4 years, as well as Muslim. June 10th, 1939. That was the day that the Germans shipped the St. Louis, which was carrying 970 passengers, most of them Jews, finally left Cuba because Cuba refused to honor the visas that they had, and waiting for the United States to say yes, they could come into the United States of America, and the American government said no. They actually had Coast Guard ships out in the water to make sure that as the ships was going up and down the coast, that Jews would not jump off the ship and try and swim to the coast. Those 970 Jews were sent back. Luckily, Britain took about 350 of them, and the rest of them were scattered in 3 other countries that eventually were occupied by the Nazis in Europe. And over half of them were murdered in the Holocaust. July 2nd, 2014. Why do I have that date on there? That's the date where 3 buses crossed the border in California into Marietta, California. Those 3 buses had young children on them who were trying to come to the United States of America as refugees. And they were sent back. Adolf Hitler, United States of America. Refugees, each case. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each and every one of us, especially how we look at people of color. And by the way, for those who don't know, Article 14th of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we are a signer of, says the right to asylum in any other countries from persecution, says that you have to take them. Nuremberg Laws, Jim Crow laws. Jews denied the right to vote. Blacks denied the right to vote. Think about what's going on, as I mentioned before. 246 laws have been introduced to suppress the vote, mostly to people of color, in the United States of America today. You want to know how this relates to white supremacy and white nationalism? "33 states had passed voter ID laws prior to what is happening now. They are a cancer that needs to be cut out of our society." Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, said that in 1935. Who was he talking about? He was talking about the Jews. They need to be cut out of our society like you would cut cancer out. They are a cancer that needs to be cut out of our society, was said by Representative John Bennett of Oklahoma on August 2014. Who was he referring to? He was referring to the Muslim community in the state of Oklahoma. And many of you may not know, some of you may, that he was just recently elected to be chairman of the Republican GOP here in Oklahoma. The more you tell a lie, the more people will believe it. Joseph Goebbels repeated that over and over and over again. The more you tell a lie, the more people will believe it. Think about the 2020 election and how 40% of Americans and about 70% of Republicans do not believe that Joe Biden was elected president of the United States. The more you tell a lie, the more people will believe it. 1.5 million. 1.5 million are the number of children who were murdered in the Holocaust. Young people who never had the opportunity to contribute to their families, to their cities, to their towns, to their countries, to the world. Murdered simply because of who they were. That number should be doubled, because normally it's when I go on for like an hour and 15 minutes, I've gone over that. So you can put it at 2,520. That's the number of children aged 5 and under in Asia and Africa who have starved to death while I've been doing this talk with you today. And you may say, what does that possibly have to do with the Holocaust? It has everything in the world to do with it, because it has to do with how we look at other human beings. When they're a different color, when they're a different race, when they're a different ethnicity, when they're a different religion. It has everything in the world to do with it. 188,000 are the number of children who will go to bed hungry in Oklahoma tonight. And 12,580,000 are the number of children who will go to bed hungry tonight in the United States of America. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us sitting here today. Here's the other reason. The picture of the fireman there, he's holding Bailey Allman, who had just turned 1 year old when she was murdered in the Oklahoma City bombing. The person being held by the soldier there is Kurt Kurdi, who had fled from Syria. He was Kurdish, he was 3 years old, and with his mother and father had gotten on a ship. It sank in the ocean, and he was washed ashore. Picture there, the crying baby, is probably one of the most iconic photographs that was taken during the Trump administration, during the immigration situation, when they were little kids were separated from their mothers and fathers. And the other picture that you see there is of Oscar Ramirez and Valeria Ramirez. She was almost 2 years old as they tried to cross the Rio Grande River, seeking asylum in the United States of America. They drowned, trying to come to freedom, seeking asylum here in the United States. And here, if you want to know why it's important, what happened, and why you speak up, that is Nuremberg, Germany, 1933. Young men carrying tiki torches, Nazis at a Nazi rally, the largest in Nazi Germany. And that, you all, is Charlottesville, Virginia, August 2017, where the alt-right, made up of KKK, neo-Nazis, Proud Boys, go through the list, marched, shouting, "Jews will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," with their tiki torches. White nationalist, white supremacist in Charlottesville. And let me assure everybody who's watching this, there were not good people on both sides. Not at all. Heather Heyer, the young woman, was murdered there when somebody ran his car into the crowd. We just passed they're trying to pass laws in this country, and I think they did here in Oklahoma recently, that says if you run over somebody at a protest, you have immunity because they shouldn't be out there doing it. That's where we are today. Maurice Stallard, 69 years old, Vicki Lee Jones, 67. October 24th, 2018, was murdered by a white nationalist at a Kroger's in Jeffersontown, Kentucky. The reason he murdered those two people is because he went hunting them. Why did he go hunting them? Because the black church that he had gone to open fire, the doors were locked and he couldn't get in. So to fulfill his mission, he went searching for other black people, and he found those two. Notice the date, October 24th, 2018. Notice the date there, October 27th, 3 days later, where 11 Jewish people who were worshiping at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh were murdered by an anti-Semite white nationalist. That's why what happened to my parents 80 years ago is important to each of us today. And that's why it's so important with what's going on in this country today. What you do matters. It matters that you stand up. It matters that you learn as much as you can and pass it on to educate other people. You can read the names here. By the way, those are the ages of people on the right-hand side, including Tamir Rice, who was 12, Quan McDonald. Why do I point those two out? I'll go back to 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered in the Holocaust. Nine and a half minutes. We were lucky. He was found guilty. Too many of those other cases, they never even had trials. And when they had, very few of them were found guilty. That's why what happened to my parents 80 years ago is important to each of us right now. And that's why it's so important that we look at how we do something about race in this country and not be afraid to talk about it. Because if we do, we are just destined to continue to repeat history and what's going on in this country today. This was December 2020 in Washington, D.C., prior to the January 6th insurrection. That is a Proud Boy wearing that T-shirt that says 6MWE. What that stands for is 6 million wasn't enough. He's a white nationalist saying that we should get rid of the Jews. You can see in the back, the other T-shirt there, Proud Boys DC Street Sweeps 2020, who of course were involved at the US Capitol. This is security, having to point guns at people who were trying to break in to stop a democratically elected election. Even during the Civil War, you all, no Confederate flag ever walked through the United States Capitol. But on that day, he proudly carries the Confederate flag through the halls of Congress. That's why what happened to my parents is so important to each and every one of us, why it's important that we speak out, and why we remember what Joseph Goebbels said. The more you tell a lie, more people will begin to believe it. And that's exactly what happened. This was also on January the 6th, wearing Camp Auschwitz shirt. Picture of a middle school students. Picture was taken in 1945. It was done at a middle school called École Mille Visite École in Paris, France. Why do I show this picture here? Because it relates directly to what's going on in this country today and what went on then. When the Nazis occupied Paris, after a few years, when they started making Jews wear the Star of David, all the educators, the principals, were told that they would tell all of their Jewish students who were still in schools there that the next day they were to come to school wearing a Star of David so that everyone would know that they were Jews. And if the Nazis came into those schools, then they could either remove them or do what they wanted. At this particular middle school, when the Jewish kids came walking into the school the next day, every one of the middle school kids were wearing Stars of David, even though they weren't Jews, so that one would know who the Jews were and who the Christian kids were. That's what you do matters in this world today. Those kids stood up for what they knew was the right thing to do. We need that now in this country. My parents did they spoke a lot, but when they couldn't speak anymore, they always wanted me to be sure and pass a message on. And I will pass that message on to each and every one of you. I went back to Germany and to Poland with my parents to do research to write the book about my parents' experience. And when we were there, we found Henryk Gorski, the son of the chief of police, who snuck into the ghetto twice to warn my dad's family about the deportations. And needless to say, my dad and he were very excited to see each other. I had a million questions to ask him, but I only needed the answer to one. Why? Why did your father do what he did? Risked his own life and his family's life. By the way, not only did he risk it, but he ended up giving his life. He and Salke both, and Wisniewski, none of the three of them made it through World War II. All of them were killed in the war. Gorski and Salke by the Nazis for helping Jews. But he said the reason his father did it is because he knew it was the right thing to do. My parents always told me to tell the students the reason that it's so important for this to learn is because that they had faith in every single one of those young people, that they were going to help make this a better world. And the reason they were going to help make it a better world is because they believed that each of them was born with something very special inside of them. What they believed they were born with was that which is inside each of us, is a Gorski, a Salke, and a Wisniewski. That which says, I will stand up and do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. In America today, you all, we need to stand up and do the right thing because we know it's the right thing to do. Speak out and confront the big lie so that hopefully we can make this a better country, that we can shut down white supremacy, white nationalism, all the bigotry that exists in people of color and other religions in our country today. Thank you all very much for being part of this conference. We greatly appreciate it.